Let's go.
You're listening to Making Data Simple, where we make the world of data effortless, relevant, and yes, even fun.
Podcast listeners, Al Martin here. I tell you, summer is almost here for those of us in the U.S. My guest is in Singapore, so I think he's in summer all the time. But for me, I just can't wait till summer starts. It cannot get here soon enough, but we're close. Today, I'm with Professor Phanish Puranam. And let me tell you a little bit about Phanish, and then I'll open it up for him to give his experience. But he is a chaired professor of strategy and organizational design at INSEAD. His research focuses on organizational science, how organizations work, how we make them work together. But he focuses on different ways in which intelligent algorithms relate to organizations in their roles as tools like machine learning applied to organizational data, human AI collaboration with teammates, even blockchain in the metaverse as templates for organizing, which I need to understand better. You know, the thing about this podcast that I always say, Phanish, is that I'm here to learn first. Today, I'm certain I'm going to achieve that objective. Welcome to the show. I greatly appreciate you being here, particularly in Singapore. What time is it there?
It's about 6 p.m. in the evening.
So you've already had your dinner and you're ready for podcast time then?
I have already, and I've had my day of sunshine, so I don't envy you.
You know, the great thing about Singapore, I love Singapore, is I don't need to iron my shirt because I just walk outside. It's ironed. I come back in. It's perfect. I love it. No, I need some weather like Singapore right now because it's been cold here for some time. Again, welcome. Please take a few moments to introduce yourself.
I've been a professor at INSEAD for 13 years now, and before that I was a professor at London Business School for about 12 years as well. So all my academic life, I've been a researcher on organizations and how they work. And throughout my career, I've been using computers to basically model and study organizations. So I build simple models of organizations using very simple AI agents to understand how they interact and what happens to hierarchies, what happens to networks, what happens to teams. So that's what I've been doing for a long time. But to be honest, it was a bit of a niche topic in my field. So yeah, it was a good career, but I certainly won't claim I was doing anything very mainstream till a few years ago. And then, of course, the AI revolution hit us, and all of a sudden, it's a bit like waking up and discovering you can speak Mandarin or something. You have a superpower you didn't know you had. So it turns out now that a lot of the work I've been doing throughout my career on understanding organizations using algorithms and now understanding how organizations are affected by algorithms, that suddenly became very important. Before I became a professor, I was an engineer. So I have a background in civil engineering, and I think that taught me most of the programming skills that I still use till today. And all my life, I guess I've been super interested in complex systems, and organizations are just a particular example.
I think organizations are very complex systems. Look, I think organizing in the age of algorithms is extremely interesting to me. Here at IBM, we're driving towards efficiency and automations within our organizations. We're doing a lot around digitizing our traditional systems like HR, IT, customer service. So very interested in what much of your research has unveiled. So talk to me a little bit about the extent of your work. I guess before you go there, though, how do you end up?
It just seemed to me a fascinating domain in which an engineering mindset and a social scientist perspective come together. Right? You have to understand organizations as social systems first and foremost. But precisely because they are so complex, you need powerful tools. And I always thought the tools that engineers have, which is to do systems thinking, use computer modeling, work with big data. I teach the people analytics class at INSEAD, for example. This seemed like a very natural way to solve the problem of complexity in organizations. So for me, it's never been anything unusual. I thought the only way we could make progress in understanding organizations is using computation.
So would you call it a passion of yours? Both very engineering much. And complex system in the form of organizational design?
Yeah, very much so. I think that's exactly why I am so much in love with the work I do.
So describe the extent of your work. Where does it begin? Where does it end? For those listeners out there, Phanish has several blogs. I'll give you a couple examples. The Freedom of Pac-Man, which is called My INSEAD Knowledge Page. He's got a couple books out there, Rehumanize, Building Human-Centric Organizations in the Age of Algorithms, Hierarchy in Organizations. And he also has bots out there, smart bots that he's built that assist with organizational design, et cetera. But tell me a little bit about all that and, where this research begins and I guess where it ends, if it does. I don't know.
Another way to describe my passion is to justify it like this. If you think about everything we have accomplished as a species, however small, however large, right? Think about building the pyramids, getting to the moon, solving for COVID, putting a vaccine out there rapidly. These are all results of organization. No individual does that. So, in that very fundamental sense, I think for our species, the most important breakthrough right after fire and the wheel is probably how to get organized. So, it's a very basic general purpose technology we have. And yet, we don't do it very reliably well. So, yes, we do amazing things, but we also get, screw ups and bureaucratic problems all the time. So, it just struck me as this has got to be the most important thing to study if you're a social scientist. How can we improve the way organizations work? So that's the broad remit of what I do. I describe myself as an organization scientist. I use scientific methods to study organizations. The core question is how do they work and how can we make them work better? So, precisely and in more detail, you would think about questions like what are the benefits and what are the disadvantages of hierarchical ways of organizing? What are some alternatives to hierarchy that we could use to organize? Should organization design be only done at the top of the company, or is this something that should occur in every team? Because in my view, every team is an organization too, right? An organization is just a group with a goal. So thinking about the levers of organization design, how much of that is structure, how much is hiring, how much is socialization, when do we put more weight on one or more of those levers? These are the kind of operational questions I deal with daily. And the way we do it is using a combination of big data. So we work with very large data sets where we have data on, for example, hierarchical structures in companies, the skills that people have when they get hired. We have data from teams that we collect ourselves. We have data on culture from text, for example, from Glassdoor. We build computational models to try and simulate these systems. And we run experiments in the lab. So we recreate small micro organizations in the lab, which last for about an hour. And we give them tasks and we try to set up these teams in different configurations, whether it's agile or traditional teams, see how they work. So it's basically the full spectrum of everything I just.
I got more questions that we have a time allowed to fit. The first question is just on your research. Is there a lot of history that you push into that research? A lot of what you've described reminds me of Yuval Noah Harari, some of his research in social systems and human systems, or is it more you identify the problem and then figure out the best solution for that particular organization or that problem?
It's more the latter. So in my day-to-day work, I don't much delve into the history of organizations and their systems. But this is not a field I invented. So organization design has been around for at least 60, 70 years as an academic discipline. In fact, the founder of the field is a very famous guy who also has the distinction of being the founder of modern AI. He's Herbert Simon, who is an economist and a Nobel laureate.
Yeah.
And a remarkable individual. He actually founded 3 fields in his lifetime: cognitive science, computer science, and organization science. So I kind of work on the organizations branch of what he started. So the field's been around for a long time. It's much more a practical social science than it is a field of history. But I do find history interesting. So you mentioned Yuval Noah Harari. I think his take on our history is very consistent with my appreciation for organizations as a core technology.
I usually end with this question, but I think it's prudent here. And then I want to go through some general questions, some of your research methodologies, some case studies perhaps. But in all of what you described with organizational design, with AI, ML, and all the technologies working to help make our organizational design efficient, where do you think we are today, just in general? And where are we going with the tools that we have to assist us?
So we're clearly at the cusp of something very interesting and exciting. I would say very different for the reason that technological changes are not new, they've been happening. But usually they affect the parts of the value chain of a business, right? They might affect a specific function or a business process or some combination. But what the current wave of AI is doing is beginning to affect general management itself, what managers do. And that I think doesn't happen very often. So the last big time that might have happened is when computers arrived or the internet arrived. And before that, perhaps the telephone, the telegraph, and things like that. So technologies that change general management are not that common. And I think the fact that the current generation of AI technologies are doing that makes it very different. Now, in terms of our exploration of the possibilities, I think we barely scratched the surface. So most people still think of using AI as using LLMs to help draft an email. Right? That's just absolutely really nothing. So that's really just the bare
Totally.
starting point.
Totally.
There's so much more one can do, and at the same time, there's so much more one should be cautious about. Right? I think both these things go hand in hand. So that's what makes it so interesting.
Look, I'm going to get out of order here. By the way, I totally agree with your last statement. I mean, that's just like as you say, to use your terms, just scratching the surface. I mean, at IBM, we're really working at enterprise solutions, and a lot of that does involve, like I said to begin the call, like our HR systems, our IT systems. Like, are you essentially using AI to create unique organizations and social structures for particular companies? Is that how it works? Are they all unique? Like you said, well, I'm trying to figure out, what are the alternatives to hierarchies, etc. What have you found?
If you'll allow me a slightly extended answer, I think it's useful to ask, like, why do we have them in the first place? Right? And it's very simple. Once you look at the question carefully and you analyze the results and the theories and the modeling, it comes down to two things. First, we are not very good at scaling consensus. So if humans were very good at achieving convergence on a course of action in large numbers, we would never need something called a manager or a boss or an authority figure. We could do it all peer to peer. So we are not very good at scaling consensus. So that's why we need an authority figure. Why do we need an hierarchy? Because no authority figure has an infinite span of control. So if you had a manager with an infinite span of control, you would have bosses but no hierarchy. So these two factors really explain why we have multi-layered hierarchies. So now we can work the logic in reverse. How do we get rid of them? Well, either we can expand the span of control of individual managers to make it very, very large, in which case we can flatten hierarchies. Or we can push in the other direction, which is improve the way people reach convergence and consensus, in which case we can do away with the system altogether. So these are the two forces really which determine whether we will have hierarchy or not. And I have an ideological point of view. I think we should be using the technology to do the second, not the first. So all else being equal, I would rather build systems that improve the capacity of people to converge peer to peer rather than create super managers. But that's my bias.
Do you think we'll naturally head in that direction, or do you think our history will keep us in hierarchy for some time?
More than history, I think it's entrenched power. So if you look at who's making decisions on investing in technology, it's the people on the top. They're hardly going to vote for a technological approach which makes them redundant. So that's unlikely. But on the other hand, a lot of innovation comes from startups, it comes from new players. And the first successful company that hits $1 billion without having to build a 10-layer hierarchy becomes an exemplar for others. And that's coming. I think the technology is clearly making it feasible to do it.
Isn't hierarchy a little bit human nature, though?
What is human nature here is worth getting into in some detail. So I looked very closely at this branch of literature called evolutionary psychology. It's our best modern understanding of why our psychology is the way it is. And the answer is it's because of natural selection. But natural selection operated in a particular context in our history, right? If you look at that research, it's very clear that we value leaders. We don't value multi-layered hierarchies. So the idea that people are somehow intrinsically tuned to having a multi-layered hierarchical system is actually false. Most of these species that come before humans are very hierarchical, like the apes. Modern humans are fairly hierarchical, but our hunter-gatherer ancestors were not. They mostly lived in two-layered systems which were relatively small. So this idea of a multi-layered hierarchy is actually very, very new. I would say it's outside of church, state, and maybe the military. It's not more than a couple of 100 years old, right? We're talking about the East India Company.
Was it exemplified by the Industrial Revolution? Is that what really put it into place and solidified it?
I think agriculture before that. So agricultural production already creates the need for hierarchy because you need large scale, you need coordination, and therefore you need managers. And Industrial Revolution just put that on steroids, and now we take it as granted. But in the larger scheme of our history, even 13,000 years is nothing really.
Can you share an example of how your research has been applied in practice to improve organizational efficiency and effectiveness?
So I can't name a particular client's name, but the typical client would really approach us with one of two problems. One is the problem of silos in large organizations. So I haven't yet met a large organization where the managers don't complain about silos, right? The fact is, there is no organization design that doesn't have silos. The only question is, do you have them in the right place? And their first impulse is, let's do a reorg, right? Which is basically shift the boxes around to face in some other direction and hope all will be well. And my job usually is to say, okay, that's the nuclear option. Are there things we can do which don't go down that path so aggressively? So we would think about, can we experiment with setting up teams that cut across these boxes? Can we set up with creating task forces? Can we experiment with hiring people who have boundary spanning skills? Would these be ways to break the silos, which are not as expensive as an entire reorg? So just getting them to think about that in the first place, I think already adds a lot of value. Then, once we have narrowed it down to a couple of things, we will actually run some pilots. So we will try a few different things, create control groups, observe the differences. And then what's good for that company is what they'll adopt. And the answer is usually very different for each company because it depends on their history, whom they've hired, the nature of work they do. But taking them through this logical process of what's the problem, why do you think this thing is the only possible solution, unfreezing them from that, showing them some other solutions, and then using data to help them make a decision. That's the usual process we take.
Problem, solution, data support the effort. Let's dive into AI and machine learning then. So, or other technologies. How do you see these technologies evolving as a tool for these organizations, and how are you leveraging them? Give us some specifics in terms of how you're supporting the evidence of the solution that has been constructed.
So the most intuitive way to think about these technologies are as tools, right? So they do things for us as tools that we couldn't have done without them. So, for instance, you want to study the culture of an organization. In the past, the only way we could have done this is gone interviewed a few people, maybe run a survey, but the data you would get would be minuscule. Now, what we can do is basically get hold of the entire stack of employee reviews on Glassdoor, to take an example. And we can really read that at scale using machine learning techniques. So we can extract the key themes. We can now even take those themes to build synthetic personas, which represent segments of employees. And we can try out new interventions. We can ask them new questions and see how they would respond. So these are essentially the use of AI as tools to help organize, which we couldn't have done, I think, without these kind of technologies. So that's the most obvious case. The more interesting stuff now is to use AI not as a tool, but as a teammate. The idea here is that we actually think of mixed decision making structures where humans and AI tackle the same problem. We call these ensembles. And we simply average them, or we take votes across a team of humans and some AIs because they're looking at the same problem but with very different data, with very different starting points, different perspectives. So it is really like thinking of a committee in which some actors are human and some are AI, and they jointly tackle the same problem, and we combine their insight in some way. And you can use that for everything from market selection to customer segmentation to making strategic decisions about M&A. So broadly speaking, I think these are the two kinds of use cases we see very often in the work we do.
I am responsible for technical sales at IBM. We'll just use that as an example. Putting all together, if you were to come to me and to see if our organization is optimal, what are some of the first steps you take?
I would start by asking you, what are your problems? What are the pain points currently? Where do things fall down most often between the cracks? Where do you see delays? Where do you see inefficiencies? Where do you see slowness? So I would start with those points and then try to understand what are the organizational drivers of that. The usual tendency is to pinpoint some poor human and say it's that poor schmuck who's kind of doing that. But sometimes it is, but not always. It can actually be the case that the people are fine, but the systems and processes around them are not. So we really want to dig down and try to understand exactly where the breakdowns are happening and then try to diagnose them. And we have an approach based on trying to define a micro organization around the set of actors involved in the problem. So I don't think of IBM as an organization. For me, IBM is a collection of thousands of organizations. What I would look at is the particular micro organization around the actors who are involved in this problem. And for that micro organization, we would ask some very basic questions. What's the objective of this micro organization? How do they do division of labor? What's the allocation of tasks? What's the division of tasks? How do they coordinate? How are they incentivized? And how do they resolve exceptions? So we call these the universal problems of organizing. Any organization has to have answers to these 5 questions. So we'll ask it about that set of micro organizations. And that will give us a good sense of where the breakdowns are most likely coming from. That's still a conjecture. Then what we would do is gather some data to test the conjecture. So we would look back into either historical records or we would run an observation period for a couple of weeks, try and gather some data. Sometimes we even do it in a workshop format in one day, where we'll kind of simulate the typical processes of this team, have them role play literally, and then spot where the blockages seem to be coming from. So we have lots of different ways of trying to get at that data. Once we have the data, then we will form some conjecture about what's a good way forward. Usually we come up with more than one, and that's where the A/B testing begins. So we will actually A/B test multiple alternatives and with random assignment if we can. If we can't, then we will do some sort of matching approach. And now increasingly, I do what I call synthetic A/B tests. We'll train teams of AIs to represent people and run them in different configurations to see if they converge or they don't converge to a solution that we're pushing. So in the end, it's going to be a recommendation that is starting with a problem, using a theoretical framework to diagnose, getting some data, extracting an insight and testing it, and then saying, here you are.
So that's kind of where the metaverse comes in then. Is that what you're saying? In other words, you're actually using AI in kind of a metaverse fashion to see if the new organization through synthetic data is going to hold up. Don't you lose the human element though? I don't know. We're humans. We're unpredictable.
Yeah, it's not a substitute for actually running it with real people, right? So the gold standard really is to run a proper field experiment in the organization, where we have different teams in different configurations, randomly assigned, we observe them for a while. That's the gold standard. I wish we could get it, right? Most of the time we can't. So the way I look at these tools is that they eliminate some of the obviously bad ideas fast, but they don't prove that it's a good idea. So we still need the human feedback to actually say this is worth implementing. But they certainly help, I think, to cut out some obviously bad ideas, which sometimes do make it through the funnel. So it's really a filtering mechanism rather than a proof mechanism to say this is the right thing.
Another general question here, though, but this is, as an expert in organizational science, what are the common pitfalls that organizations fall into when they're trying to implement either new technologies to do this and or just in organizational design in general?
Maybe start with the technology first, since that's kind of also the topic of our conversation. This is not specific to AI. I think too often the adoption process is let's do some of this tech. Why? Because everybody else is doing it, and the consultants are telling us this is good. That's obviously wrong, right? The way to approach this is what's the problem we have, and will this tech solve it, and how? The second very common mistake is to think that buying the tech is the solution. 70-80% of the work is around getting the people aligned to actually adopt the technology and use it in a smart way. So these are the two most common problems which I think apply to pretty much any technology adoption. There's a new one with AI, which is a little bit more insidious, I think. A lot of these AI tools, when used today, can actually amplify human performance very rapidly. But that doesn't mean they improve human skills. In fact, they may cause an atrophy in human skills. So you can get this cycle of over-dependence on these technologies to do cognitive work, right? Which till a few years ago we had no alternative but to do ourselves. Now GPTs are pretty good substitutes for design thinking, for ideation, for statistical analysis, what you used to call higher order cognitive skills. We can rely on them to some extent. And it is very tempting to do it because it's fast, it's cheap, it's on your fingertips. But that's a very dangerous path, I think, if it's invoked without thinking. Because a lot of our skills are of the use it or lose it kind. So the skills we don't use, we lose. And some of those skills are critical for learning new skills. So you're not just losing skills in this domain, you're also potentially losing the pathway towards upskilling towards new tasks. So that's a new kind of danger, which I don't think was so rampant earlier, but now it is. So that's the third sort of issue I think is very important to think about.
Let's dive down into the technical details on maybe a traditional use case. It's hard because it sounds like there's so many different use cases. As you mentioned, you got to solve or identify the problem, then you identify the solution, then you prove it out. But as you're proving out some of these use cases, how does that typically work? Do you start with a large language model, use like a RAG algorithm to grab data, ask it questions relative to the new model?
So maybe I should take a concrete example and walk you end to end through where we use technology at each point, right?
Yes, I would love it. Yes.
So here's a large company which has joint headquarters in Singapore and London. I can't say more, but this will probably already let you guess which one it is. So they went through a pretty major reorganization, and the question they came to us was, did it work? So the reorganization was done. It was in the past. But they were considering doing something similar, and they didn't really have a good idea about whether the past one had worked. How do we go about answering this question? So at this stage, we don't need any AI, right? We already know from the prior research and our own thinking about this that one very easy way to measure and come up with an answer to this is to look at social networks. So what we essentially did is build a database of all the email traffic in the company and the file sharing traffic in the company, which is all in their servers. So it's like millions and millions of data points. So I had a team of people kind of pull that data together, grad students. And we constructed social networks and compared them before and after the reorg. Because if a reorg works, it is going to change the networks, right? That's just a given. If it doesn't move the networks, the reorg hasn't done anything. So we could actually build that network structure. And given the network structure, we could create like a control group, a different part of the organization which hadn't gone through the change, and compare the two trends in terms of how the networks changed. And it turned out it did work. The reorg in the past had actually worked. However, it had not worked equally well everywhere, right? And now the question is, why was that? Like, why is more effective in some parts of the organization than the other? So we could collect a bunch of interviews from people, and that's where we put it into one of our customized GPTs. So I have a custom GPT called Unomicon. So Unomicon is essentially an org design co-pilot, which has through RAG been given a lot of the knowledge base that comes from our research, and it can do diagnosis. So if you give it all this data and say, synthesize for me 5 possible reasons why the reorg was effective in this part of the company but not here, it'll probably give you 15. So there's no shortage of ideation there. So it'll come up with a lot of ideas. And I think that's really powerful because you can do this in conjunction with the client, right? I don't have to just be there on the podium telling them this is the answer. They can do it themselves. But I can help them sense make those and kind of narrow it down to two or three. And it'll also tell you, okay, if it's these two or three, what more data do we need to gather to verify or to confirm or disconfirm which of these three things it is? So in this particular case, it turned out to be a time zone effect. So where the reorg really wasn't solving the problem of silos was where people were fundamentally separated by time zones. So time zones are time zones, right? You can change the org chart, you can't change the clock. So what are we going to do about that was the question. So it led to a basic rethinking of how the business process itself had to operate. We had to split it up in different ways so that the time zone handoffs were reduced. They didn't have to make these dramatic handoffs over time zones. So that gives you, I hope, a sense of how we use data in different parts and how we use AI in it.
It does, but it sounds like, let me see if I can say this back to you. You have a custom LLM you created essentially for organizational design that'll help you navigate that through natural language.
Yep.
And give you better ideation. But what parameters go into that? Not like LLM parameters. I'm talking about, you talked about, you got to ingest the social networks, like you said, patterns that you see in the business. That sounds like a lot of work. I mean, how do you know what to ingest into the LLM to give you the answers that you're looking for?
One of the beauties of these natural language based tools is they can be wrappers on much more complicated things underneath, right? So on the surface, it's really having a conversation with the way you would with a human, saying, here's my organizational design problem. I have silos here, or I have blockages here, or decisions are slow here. And it would basically ask you a series of diagnostic questions. So it would say, is this possible? Is that possible? Do you see this as well? Do you see that as well? Where does that knowledge base come from, I guess, is your question. And the answer is that comes from our research. So the documents that go into the RAG to create these things is really like a stack of about 100 pages of research.
So let me say it this way. Let me be over dramatize it. I couldn't go out to an LLM, just a generic LLM, and ask them some of the same questions because I don't have the research database that you're ingesting through RAG around organizational design.
Precisely.
Is that accurate to say?
It's accurate.
And these are learnings you've gathered over, what'd you say, 7 to 10 years that you've been doing this? Or where do those learnings come from?
No, it comes from my research, and I would say it's about 20 years of it. So there's a lot of it.
Is it, I presume not, is it open source? How do you, I mean, like if I said, hey, I want to leverage Phanish's research here in that LLM, what would I do? What's the process to engage?
We have a open source version, which is simply a custom GPT. So you're very welcome to use that. That's free to the world to use. So personally, I feel, by the way, org design is a field that's so important. We should be democratizing knowledge about it. So I don't intend to hoard it. But we are building a professional product as well, which will have a fee attached to it because it does more things. But the basic version is free. I can send you a link at the end of this talk if you like.
If I was to go use that link that you give me, what should I start? What questions? Just randomly start throwing questions in there, or how would you direct me?
So I would ask you to first watch a series of very short videos. Each one is about 5 or 6 minutes long. There are 6 of them. Because I think to get the best out of an AI requires a well-prepared human. So organizational design is a very complex field. There's a lot of complexity. Some of it is human created because of jargon. but some is because the systems are really very complex. So you need to probably spend half an hour to 40 minutes looking through those videos. Then you will have the vocabulary to have a really good conversation with the bot. At that point, you can ask any question that you think is an important burning issue for you. And I think you'll get a good response.
How much how much is this is culture? And the reason why I asked that, you just said something that triggered something. It's like some of our organizational design, I think, is almost complex by design. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but if you look like the U.S. tax system, like they could make it efficient. Like they could say 13% tax. That's it across everything. You make $100, 13%. You make $0, 13% is zero. But they'll never do that because there's power in having that control of where you want to put the tax implications and the give and the takes. How much do you think it's culture that you're dealing with?
What you just described, I wouldn't classify as culture as much as just the incentives, right? The power structure and the incentives of people who have the power to make these decisions may or may not align with making it simple. So that's always going to be the case, even in an organization, for sure. But generally speaking, I think there are three big pillars in organizational design. The structure is only one part of it. The structure, by which I mean, like, are you grouped by division, by function, by geography, how many layers in the hierarchy? That's very salient, but it's only one third of the story. The other big part is the culture, which is in the sense of the shared beliefs and the shared values in the system. And the third big part, which is even more invisible, is hiring. Right? One of the big drivers of org design is who you hire. So it's like a game of baseball, right? So why does this team do well and that one doesn't? They're playing the same game. Well, the rules are the same, but they have different members. They have different internal structures. They've been socialized differently. So it's the same with companies, I think. It's the hiring effect, it's the structure effect, and it's the socialization effect. So all three really come together to produce an outcome.